Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightfall Narratives. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and forward, and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. A young college student steps into the quiet hallway of her new apartment building, the heavy door closing behind her with a dull thud that seems to echo too long. The air is thick, carrying a scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Her shoes click against the worn tiles, their surface chipped and faded, tracing the steps of countless others who had come before her. It's an old building, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, the kind of place you'd drive by without giving it a second thought. From the start, something feels off. It's not just the flickering light at the end of the hallway, or the way the walls seem to press in as she walks. It's the silence, the kind that sits heavy, like a presence waiting just beyond sight. The building is almost too quiet, as though its occupants are ghosts hiding behind closed doors. She reaches her new apartment, small but adequate for her needs, and for a moment, there's a flicker of hope. It's her fresh start, her escape from the chaos of dorm life. But the feeling is fleeting. She notices her neighbor on the first day. He doesn't greet her, just stands at his door, the faint outline of his figure visible in the dim light. She can't quite make out his face, just the impression of eyes watching her, even when she isn't looking. He's there again the next day, and the next. Always in the same spot, his door barely cracked open, a shadow lurking in the gap. At first, she shrugs it off. Everyone in the city is a little strange, right? But there's something about the way he watches her, something she can't shake, that makes the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Each time she walks by, the sensation of being observed follows her, thick and inescapable, like a cold hand resting too long on her skin. Her mind tells her it's nothing, just nerves, just a new place. But deep down, she knows. This place is wrong, and that man, he's something else entirely. The days pass, and the unease settles deeper into her bones. The building feels oppressive, as if it's watching her with unseen eyes, the walls whispering secrets she can't quite hear. Every time she crosses the hallway, she finds her neighbor standing there, silent, still, with that same barely visible silhouette behind the cracked door. It's always the same, the door ajar just enough for her to sense him watching, never stepping out, never speaking. She tries to avoid looking, tries to tell herself it's her imagination. But the feeling lingers, that gnawing certainty that he's waiting for something, something involving her. Then, the subtle invasions begin. Late at night, she hears knocks on her door, faint at first, but persistent. They come at odd hours, just as she's drifting off to sleep, pulling her back into a state of heightened awareness. She sits up in bed, staring at the door, her heart pounding, listening for anything else, a sound, a breath, a movement on the other side. But nothing comes. When she checks the peephole, there's no one there, just the dim, empty hallway. The next night, the sensation of being watched returns, not just from the hallway, but from the window. Her apartment faces the courtyard, and across the way, the neighbor's apartment is directly opposite hers. She pulls back the curtain late one night, feeling an overwhelming urge to check, and there he is, standing in his window, staring directly into hers, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Her breath catches in her throat. She quickly draws the curtain, heart racing. The city feels far away, and the safety of being alone in her own space evaporates, replaced by the suffocating presence of her silent observer. She starts changing her routine, taking different paths through the building, leaving earlier, returning later, anything to avoid crossing paths with him. But no matter what she does, he's always there, lurking, waiting. Her thoughts start to spiral. Is she imagining it? Is it all in her head? But the feeling is too real, too thick, like a weight pressing down on her chest. It's not just paranoia. He's fixated on her, and whatever his intentions are, they're not innocent. She wants to confront him, to demand why he's always watching, why he knocks in the dead of night. But something in his stillness keeps her from acting. Deep down, she's afraid that once she breaks the silence, something far worse will reveal itself. The nights grow longer, darker, and the strange happenings intensify. At first, it's just the knocks, always faint, always at odd hours, But then other sounds start to seep through the thin walls of her apartment. Muffled whispers, voices too distorted to make out, like someone speaking in low tones right next door. Sometimes there's the sound of heavy furniture being dragged, slow and deliberate, punctuated by an eerie, intermittent thud. One night, as she lies in bed, straining to hear, something changes. Among the usual strange noises, she catches the faintest sound of crying. It's soft, barely audible, like someone in pain trying desperately not to be heard. It sends a shiver down her spine. She sits up, heart pounding, and presses her ear to the wall. The crying stops, but the silence that follows feels worse. Thick, suffocating, like the building itself is holding its breath. She starts staying up late, keeping her lights off, just listening. The noises continue, erratic and unsettling, always coming from her neighbor's apartment. Sometimes the whispers sound almost ritualistic. The language is foreign, unfamiliar, with a rhythmic cadence that makes her skin crawl. It's as if she's overhearing something that shouldn't be heard, something meant to stay hidden behind closed doors. Her curiosity takes root, slowly overpowering her fear. She tries to observe without being noticed, leaving her apartment door slightly open when she hears him in the hallway, or pressing her ear to the wall when the sounds begin again at night. Every time she gets close, the noises stop, as though he knows she's listening. During the day, she begins researching. She checks old tenant records, scanning through the building's history, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the strangeness surrounding her neighbor. Most of the residents have come and gone, leaving no trace, but she discovers one thing. Her neighbor's apartment has had more tenants than any other unit in the building, many of whom left suddenly without a forwarding address. It's as if they vanished into thin air, their names erased from memory. When she tries to talk to the other residents, they become evasive. The elderly woman down the hall glances nervously at her door when asked about the neighbor, muttering something about bad things happening in that apartment, but refuses to say more. The other tenants either ignore her questions or act like they don't know who she's talking about. It's as if her neighbor is a shadow, someone nobody wants to acknowledge, as though speaking of him would somehow bring his attention to them. One evening, the sounds from next door become louder, more distinct. This time, the crying is unmistakable. It's not just fear or pain, it's raw desperation. She clutches her phone, debating whether to call for help, but something in her gut tells her it won't be that simple. She knows she's being drawn deeper into something far darker than she ever expected. And yet, the pull is undeniable. She has to know. The question gnaws at her mind, consuming her thoughts day and night. What is happening in that apartment? And why does it feel like the answer is waiting for her to find it? One night, after days of restless watching and sleepless nights, she notices something different. Her neighbor's door is slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the dim hallway. It's late, too late for visitors, and the silence in the building is thicker than usual, the kind that presses against your skin. Her heart pounds, but there's something about the open door that compels her. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's the need for answers, but she knows this is her chance. She steps out of her apartment, barely breathing as she creeps toward the door. The hallway feels endless, and with each step the silence seems to grow louder, humming in her ears. When she reaches the door, she hesitates. There's a moment, a fleeting second, where she considers turning back, slamming her own door shut, and pretending this is all some terrible dream. But she doesn't. Instead, she pushes the door open, slowly, as if any sudden movement might wake something lurking inside. The apartment beyond is dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. The air inside is stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far more unsettling, a rotting, metallic odor that churns her stomach. She steps inside. The place is eerily empty at first glance. Sparse furniture, dust thick on every surface, like it hasn't been touched in years. But something is wrong, horribly wrong. As she moves deeper into the apartment, her eyes are drawn to the walls, where symbols, intricate and disturbing, are scrawled in a dark, sticky substance. They wind across the walls, twisting and turning like they have a life of their own, forming patterns she doesn't recognize, but instinctively knows are ancient. Her skin crawls. The symbols seem to pulse, almost alive, and the air grows colder the further she moves into the space. She passes through the small living room and into a hallway, where a single door at the end stands slightly open. A faint light spills out from the crack, flickering like a candle. She knows she shouldn't go further, but something deep and primal urges her on. She reaches the door, hand trembling as she pushes it open. Inside, the room is small, claustrophobic, and filled with things that don't belong. Strange artifacts, old, weathered bones, jars filled with dark, murky liquids, and more symbols etched into the walls and floor. In the center of the room is an altar, crude and ominous, covered in more of the same dark substance that lines the walls. But it's the thing hanging from the ceiling that makes her blood run cold. A large, tattered sheet hangs, shrouding something beneath it, its shape distorted but unmistakably human. The smell hits her then, decay, thick and suffocating, the stench of death. She stumbles back, her hand flying to her mouth as her stomach churns violently, and then she hears it. A soft rustling, like something shifting beneath the sheet. She freezes, heart hammering in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But before she can, the sheet falls away, revealing the true horror beneath it. It's not human, at least not anymore. What's left is something twisted, deformed beyond recognition, its limbs contorted in impossible angles, its skin stretched tight and gray. But it's the eyes, lifeless and yet somehow watching her, that paralyze her in place. The thing is suspended, hanging by ropes tied to hooks embedded in the ceiling. It's as if it's been displayed, sacrificed, or worse, kept alive by some dark, malevolent force. A low, guttural whisper fills the room, and she realizes with dawning terror that it's coming from behind her. She turns slowly, her breath catching in her throat, and there stands her neighbor. His eyes are wide, unblinking, and his lips move silently, mouthing the same dark words she had heard through the walls. And in that moment, she knows. This isn't just some twisted ritual or dark obsession. This room, this apartment, it's a gateway, a place where something ancient and unspeakable has been called, and it's waiting for her. The realization slams into her like a wave of ice. This isn't just a man with strange habits, nor a curiosity gone too far. What she stumbled upon is something ancient, something evil, and it has been waiting for her all along. Her neighbor stands motionless, eyes wide, his lips still moving in that whispered, indecipherable chant. The air in the room vibrates with something unseen, a dark force that seems to pulse from the symbols on the walls, through the very floor, and into her bones. It's not just fear anymore, it's a presence, thick and alive, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She backs away, her gaze flickering between the grotesque figure hanging from the ceiling and her neighbor, whose chant grows louder, more urgent. The words, though alien, begin to take shape in her mind. She doesn't understand them, not fully, but she knows they're calling to something older than time, something that exists beyond the thin veil of reality. Suddenly, the room itself seems to shift. The shadows deepen, stretching unnaturally across the walls, twisting into shapes that writhe and coil like living things. The symbols pulse, growing brighter, as if drawing energy from the air around them, feeding off her fear. The figure hanging from the ceiling stirs, and her heart seizes in terror. Its twisted, decaying form twitches, a slow, agonizing movement that sends a chill down her spine. Then she feels it, the presence. It's no longer just lingering, it's here, in the room with her. A cold, suffocating weight that presses against her chest, seeping into her skin. She knows, deep down, that it's been watching her from the moment she moved into the apartment. The strange occurrences, the noises, her neighbor's unsettling behavior, all of it had been leading to this. It's been waiting for her, drawing her closer, luring her to this moment. She turns to run, but the door slams shut behind her with a force that rattles the walls. She's trapped. Her neighbor's chanting reaches a fevered pitch, his voice rising as he steps toward her, his eyes wide with a mix of ecstasy and terror. She can see it in his face. He's not in control. He's merely a vessel, a pawn in whatever horrific ritual has been unfolding in this cursed apartment. Desperation fuels her next move. She grabs the nearest object, a heavy, rusted candlestick from the altar, and swings it at the neighbor with all her strength. The blow connects, sending him sprawling to the ground, his chanting cut off mid-word. But the silence that follows is far worse. The presence in the room grows heavier, angrier, and the air turns bitterly cold. The figure hanging from the ceiling twitches violently, and then, with a sickening crack, its head snaps toward her. It shouldn't be possible. The thing has been dead for who knows how long, but its eyes, clouded and glassy, lock onto hers, filled with a malevolent hunger. It opens its mouth, and though no sound escapes, she can feel the scream reverberate through the air, a silent wail that shakes the very foundation of the apartment. The floor beneath her feet begins to shift, as if the room itself is no longer stable. The symbols on the walls writhe and pulse, their light blinding, and the shadows deepen, taking on forms she can barely comprehend, dark, twisted figures reaching out, clawing at the edges of her vision. She feels the pull now, a force trying to drag her deeper into the room, deeper into whatever dark dimension the ritual has opened. Her mind races. She has to escape. But how? The door is sealed. The walls seem to close in on her, and the thing in the room once dead is now very much alive. Alive with a hunger that seeks to consume her. But then a thought cuts through the chaos. The symbols. They're not just random markings. They're a language, a ritual, a way to summon, but also a way to bind. If they can call forth whatever this thing is, maybe they can send it back. She remembers fragments of the neighbor's chant, the way the words had twisted in her mind, and though she doesn't understand their meaning, she begins to whisper them, her voice trembling. The room reacts. The presence shifts, the air vibrating with a new energy, and the shadows hesitate as if confused. She continues, her voice growing stronger, repeating the chant as the symbols pulse brighter, flickering like a dying light. The figure hanging from the ceiling thrashes violently now, its body contorting in unnatural ways, its gaze locked on her with a fury that threatens to swallow her whole. But she doesn't stop. The words flow from her lips, a desperate litany, and with each syllable, the room shudders. The shadows pull back, the walls seem to stabilize, and the suffocating weight begins to lift. The figure screeches silently, its form twisting and fading, the symbols on the walls burning brighter until they explode in a blinding flash of light. And then, silence. She's alone. The room, once alive with dark energy, is now still. The figure is gone, the symbols on the walls blackened, smoldering like burnt paper. Her neighbor lies unconscious on the floor, his body limp, as though whatever had possessed him has finally let go. But as she stumbles out of the apartment, heart racing, she knows it's not over. Whatever she banished tonight isn't gone. It's waiting, waiting for another door to open, waiting for another soul to pull into the darkness. She stumbles down the hallway, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from what she's just witnessed. The building seems unchanged on the surface, the same cracked walls, the same flickering lights, but everything feels wrong. The air is heavy, oppressive, as if the evil from that room still lingers, clinging to the shadows that stretch unnaturally along the corridor. Her apartment feels no safer now. It's cold and empty, but there's a sense that she's no longer alone. Even though the entity is gone, for now, she can still feel its presence just on the other side of reality, watching, waiting for its chance to return. She tries to pack, her hands shaking, tossing clothes into a suitcase with frantic, jerky movements. She has to leave. Get out of this building, escape the city maybe. But even as she moves with growing urgency, there's a nagging voice in the back of her mind, whispering that running won't be enough. This thing, whatever it was, isn't confined to that apartment. It's bigger than the building, bigger than the city. It's everywhere, lurking just beneath the surface of the world, and no matter where she goes, it can find her again. But she doesn't care. She has to try. Just as she's zipping up the suitcase, she hears it, a soft knock at her door. Her heart freezes, the blood in her veins turning to ice. It's the same knock, the same quiet, persistent tap that had haunted her before. Slowly, she approaches the door, her hands trembling, and looks through the peephole. There's no one there. But the knock comes again, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, is on the other side knows she's watching. She backs away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She grabs her suitcase and heads for the fire escape, her only thought being to get out, to escape this nightmare once and for all. But as she steps into the stairwell, she hears another noise, something much worse than the knock. It's a low, guttural whisper, echoing from somewhere deep in the building, the same dark chant her neighbor had whispered. the same ancient words that had summoned the thing in the first place. And it's spreading, growing louder, not just from the apartment next door, but from every corner of the building, as if the whole place is alive with the same dark ritual. She races down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, the whispers growing louder with every step, following her, chasing her. By the time she bursts through the front door and into the cold night air, the building behind her seems to pulse with that dark, twisted energy. She doesn't stop running until she's far from the building, far from the place where everything went wrong. But even as she stands on the deserted street, panting and looking back at the distant silhouette of the building, she knows she hasn't escaped. Not really. The darkness isn't just in that apartment. It's everywhere, like a shadow that will never stop following her, no matter how far she runs. She's left the building behind, but she hasn't left the entity behind. And she knows, deep down, that this is only the beginning. The story ends with her standing there, the wind cold against her skin, as the distant sound of the chanting fades into silence. But the silence isn't comforting. It's the kind that stretches before something worse, something inevitable. And she knows, eventually, it will come for her again. The darkness is patient, and it never forgets. The air was still as the young architect stepped out of her car, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings of her new neighborhood. The houses along the street were orderly, pristine, each one radiating a quiet charm, as if nothing could ever go wrong here. She smiled, feeling a sense of comfort, of new beginnings. But her eyes were drawn to the corner of the street, where something dark and broken disrupted the perfect view. There it was, a house that time had forgotten. Its once white paint was now cracked and peeling. Vines clawed their way up the crumbling walls, and the windows were like hollow eyes staring out into the street. It stood there, silent, but it called to her in a way that made her heart skip. She felt something, an unshakable pull. Neighbors walked past, some glancing at the house, their faces twisting momentarily with unease before they hurried along, pretending not to notice. The young woman felt her breath catch, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as she stared at the decaying structure. There was something about it, something that whispered to her without words. A quiet voice at the back of her mind urged her to turn away, but she couldn't. Instead, she found herself thinking about the house more and more with each passing day. Its dark silhouette seemed to linger in her thoughts, haunting her quiet moments, drawing her in. What stories lay within those walls? What had happened to the people who once lived there? The curiosity became a weight on her chest, a pressure she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was harmless, just an architect's professional intrigue. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The house was waiting for her. It started with glances. Each time the architect passed by the decaying house, her eyes would drift toward it, pulled by an unseen force. Days went by, and each time she lingered a little longer, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind its weathered walls. It wasn't just professional curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something almost compulsive. The neighbors had been no help. When she asked casually about the house during friendly small talk, their expressions would change, tightening, as if she had crossed an invisible line. They would offer vague responses, quickly steering the conversation elsewhere. There were no stories, no explanations, just avoidance. The house was like a scar they all chose to ignore. One evening, as she stood at her window, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, her gaze wandered to the house again. It stood there, a silent monument of neglect. But this time, it seemed different. She swore she saw movement, a flicker of something behind the darkened windows. Her heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. She stared, waiting, watching, but nothing else moved. Still, it was enough. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The house had become an obsession, its presence in her mind growing stronger, more insistent. She needed to know. There was a history there, something no one wanted to talk about. But if no one would tell her, she would find out on her own. The next morning, without hesitation, she made her decision. She would go inside. Just a quick look, she told herself. Nothing too serious, just enough to satisfy her curiosity. She gathered her things, her heartbeat quickening as she walked toward the house. Each step felt heavier, as though something was trying to hold her back, but she pushed forward. The front gate creaked loudly as she nudged it open, a sound that echoed down the empty street. The path leading to the front door was overgrown, weeds clawing at her ankles as she approached. Standing at the entrance, she paused. The air felt different here, thicker, colder. Her hand hovered over the rusted doorknob, a moment of doubt creeping in. But curiosity had already taken root, stronger than fear. She turned the knob. The door groaned open, revealing the dark, musty interior. As she stepped inside, the heavy air swallowed her whole, and the door shut behind her with a dull thud. The house was even more oppressive inside than she had imagined. The air was thick with dust, making every breath feel heavy. Shadows clung to every corner, and the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows only seemed to accentuate the gloom. The floor creaked under her weight as she moved cautiously, each step echoing in the empty, hollow space. Old furniture lay abandoned, draped in sheets that had long since turned yellow with age. Spiderwebs hung like curtains in doorways, and the wallpaper, once elegant, peeled away in long, curling strips. It was as though the house had been waiting for someone to return, locked in a perpetual state of decay. As she explored the first floor, her fingers traced the dusty surface of a wooden table, her mind racing with questions. Who had lived here? Why had they left? She moved from room to room, her curiosity growing, but there was little more than silence and emptiness. It was in the hallway that she found it, an old chest, tucked beneath the decaying staircase, hidden under layers of dust and debris. Her heart pounded as she knelt before it, the air growing colder, sharper, like the house was holding its breath, watching her every move. The chest was locked, but the brittle wood had long since weakened. A few tugs and it splintered open. Inside were the diaries, stacked neatly, their leather covers worn and faded, as if untouched for years. She hesitated before picking one up, the weight of it heavy in her hands, as though it contained more than just words. Flipping through the pages, the early entries were unremarkable. Mundane details of daily life, descriptions of the family who once called this place home. A couple, their young child, filled with hopes for their future in this very house. But as she turned the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries shorter, filled with dread. Strange things are happening. We hear whispers at night. Something is in the house with us. Her breath hitched as she continued reading, her eyes darting over the frantic scrawl of the later entries. The family had become convinced that the house was haunted. No, worse than haunted. They spoke of an unseen presence, of being watched, followed. The child began to sleepwalk, always waking near the basement door. The husband started hearing voices, and the wife saw figures moving just outside her vision, shadows where there should be none. The final entry was short, the ink smudged as if written in a hurry. It wants us. We can't leave. We should have never opened the door. A shiver ran down her spine as she closed the diary, the cold weight of dread settling deep in her bones. The house had consumed them, trapped them, twisted their minds, and now she was here, reading their final words. But what had happened to them? Where had they gone? The diaries offered no answers, only more questions. Yet as she stood there holding the book, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't empty. Something had stayed behind, something that hadn't left when the family did, and now it was aware of her. After the discovery of the diaries, the atmosphere around her seemed to shift. It began slowly, so subtle that at first she thought she was imagining it. A cold draft would pass through her apartment, even though the windows were shut tight. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed darker, as if they were hiding something. She chalked it up to paranoia, the natural result of reading such disturbing words. But soon, it became undeniable. At night, she heard sounds she couldn't explain, the creaking of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom, faint whispers that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced someone had been standing in her room, watching her. But every time she looked, the room was empty. As the days passed, the occurrences grew more intense. Objects in her apartment weren't where she had left them. Lights flickered without reason, and the sound of something tapping on her windows became a regular nighttime visitor. But worst of all were the glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment she turned her head. The presence she had read about in the diaries wasn't confined to the house anymore. It had followed her home. At first, she tried to ignore it, pretending everything was fine. But her thoughts always drifted back to the house, to the family who had vanished without a trace. Their terror-filled words haunted her, and deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken them was now turning its attention to her. In desperation, she returned to the house, hoping to find answers in the forgotten rooms she hadn't yet explored. Maybe there was something she had missed, something that could explain the growing madness that seemed to be invading her life. The house felt different now, more alive than it had during her first visit. The air seemed heavier, thick with something she couldn't name. She could feel it watching her as she walked through the familiar decayed halls. It was as if the house itself was breathing, waiting. As she ventured deeper, the whispers from the diaries began to echo in her mind, overlapping with the noises in the house, footsteps behind her, doors creaking open on their own, and that same oppressive cold that seeped into her bones. The presence was no longer a vague feeling. It was real, palpable, and getting closer. In one of the upstairs rooms, she saw it for the first time, a shape, barely visible, standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the space with a suffocating weight. Her body froze, terror gripping her, but she forced herself to blink, to look again. The shape was gone, but she knew it was still there. It was always there. The diaries had warned of something watching, waiting, and now she felt it. The family hadn't been driven mad by their own fears. They had been hunted by something malevolent, something that fed on their terror. And now it had set its sights on her. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive with the very thing that had consumed its previous inhabitants. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting her go. The days blurred into one another, each one bringing with it a new layer of dread. The presence in her life was no longer confined to the abandoned house. It followed her everywhere. At work, she felt eyes on her back, cold fingers brushing her skin when no one was near. At night, her dreams were plagued by the house, its dark windows and endless hallways trapping her in a nightmare she could never escape. Each time she woke, she was drenched in sweat, her heart racing as if she had been running for her life. But it wasn't just dreams anymore. The presence was real, and it was tightening its grip on her. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing fear that grew stronger with each passing hour. It had begun to speak to her, not in words, but in sensations. The cold that wrapped around her when she was alone, the oppressive weight in the air, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. The house was reaching out to her, and she was powerless to resist. Desperation gnawed at her mind. She couldn't go on like this, not knowing what was happening to her, not knowing how to stop it. The diaries had spoken of a family unraveling under the weight of the house's influence, their minds twisted and broken. Was she destined to share their fate? Would she too disappear, swallowed by the darkness that lurked within those walls? Determined to break free, she returned to the house one last time. She needed answers, something that would explain the madness that had taken hold of her life. If she could just understand what had happened to the family, maybe she could stop it from happening to her. The house greeted her with a familiar chill as she stepped inside, the air thick with malevolence. She made her way through the rotting rooms, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve in her body on edge. The walls seemed to close in around her, as if the house itself were alive, waiting for her to make her final move. In the basement, she found it, the truth she had been searching for, though it was more horrifying than she could have imagined. There, hidden beneath layers of dust and debris, were old photographs, more diaries, and newspaper clippings that detailed the disappearances. The family hadn't just vanished. They had become part of the house, their minds consumed by the entity that resided within it, the same entity that was now coming for her. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and she felt it, the presence, stronger than ever, closing in around her. The air pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The house had her now, just as it had them. It wanted her fear, her life, and it wouldn't let her leave. She tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the darkness. Panic surged through her as she pounded on the walls, screamed for help, but there was no one to hear her. The shadows closed in, swallowing the light, swallowing her. In those final moments, she understood. The house didn't just want to scare her. It wanted to claim her, to pull her into its depths and keep her there forever, just as it had done to the others. And so, the house waited again, standing quietly at the corner of the street, dark and decaying as the world moved on around it. Another soul lost to its hunger, another story left untold. It was patient. It always was. There would be more. There were always more. The house was silent. Days passed, then weeks. The neighbors went about their lives, deliberately avoiding the old, crumbling structure on the corner. No one asked about the young architect who had moved into the neighborhood so full of life, full of curiosity. They noticed her absence, of course, but they said nothing. They knew. The house had taken another. Inside, time stood still. The air was thick, unmoving, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The walls, once full of decay, seemed more settled now, satisfied. In the far corners of the rooms, shadows lingered a little longer, clinging to the edges of the broken furniture. The house was not empty. It never had been. Some nights, if you were to stand outside on the street, you might feel it. An uneasy stillness that wraps itself around you, a sudden drop in temperature, like the house is watching, waiting. If you listened closely enough, you might even hear it. The faint sound of footsteps moving within, a whisper too quiet to catch, the briefest flicker of a shape passing by a window. But no one dares to get too close. The house remains there, as it always will, sitting quietly in the corner of the street, its history hidden in layers of dust and shadow. It has claimed many, and it will claim more, feeding on the curiosity of those who wander too close, drawn in by its mystery, by the silence that conceals something far darker. The architect was gone now, just another presence in the shadows, part of the house like those before her. The neighborhood would forget her, just as they had forgotten the family. The house made sure of that. And yet the house waited, as it always did, patient, unchanging. It would lure in another soon enough. After all, there's always someone curious enough to open the door, to step inside, to think they can uncover its secrets. But the house has no secrets, only hunger. The desert stretches out endlessly beneath a sky painted in dark hues, with only the faintest stars offering light. A lone trucker grips the steering wheel, his hands steady after years on the road. The hum of the engine is his only companion, as the massive rig cuts through the silence of the night. It's a stretch of highway few dare to travel, isolated, forgotten, and infamous for strange disappearances. He's driven it before, knows every turn, every dip in the cracked asphalt, but tonight feels different. There's a weight in the air, something thick and oppressive that clings to the cab of his truck. The radio hisses with static, the station barely holding, as if even the signals are reluctant to linger here. The wind outside howls in the distance, a low, mournful sound that seems to echo for miles. But he's not worried. He's seen worse, driven through storms that would shake most men. He's faced exhaustion and roads that seem to go on forever. But tonight, as the darkness presses in, there's an unease creeping up his spine. The kind of feeling that whispers something is watching, something is waiting. The headlights cut a narrow path through the blackness, but beyond them the world feels like a void. The kind of void where things vanish without a trace. And as the miles slip by, that unease grows, gnawing at him. Because on this road, there are places where the night isn't just dark. It's alive. The trucker glances in his rearview mirror, more out of habit than concern, but something catches his eye. At first, it's just a glint, faint headlights far off in the distance. It's nothing unusual, just another vehicle out on the road, though it seems odd given the desolation of the highway. He shrugs it off and keeps driving, focusing on the long stretch ahead. Minutes pass, and the lights grow brighter, closer. He eases his foot off the gas, thinking maybe the driver wants to pass, but something nags at him. The vehicle's movements don't feel right. It stays too perfectly aligned with his truck, matching his speed in a way that makes the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The trucker shifts in his seat, flicking his blinker to switch lanes, expecting the car to pass. But it doesn't. It stays right behind him, too close for comfort now. The lights are blinding in his mirrors, almost unnatural in their brightness. His hands tighten on the wheel as a cold knot of anxiety starts to form in his stomach. He picks up speed, but the vehicle follows suit, never falling behind, never overtaking him. It's like a shadow, glued to his bumper, silent and menacing. His heart begins to pound, and he takes another glance in the mirror, hoping to make out the driver, but all he can see are those blinding headlights. The darkness surrounding him feels heavier now, like it's closing in, suffocating. Something's wrong. He's driven these roads for years, and no one behaves like this out here. The trucker's instincts scream at him. This isn't a normal car. It's something else, something dangerous, and it's not here by chance. The trucker's pulse quickens as he grips the wheel tighter, trying to shake off the rising panic. He presses down harder on the gas, the engine roaring as the rig picks up speed. But the car behind him stays locked in place, its headlights still flooding his mirrors, too close, far too close. It's as if the vehicle is tethered to him, a shadow that refuses to let go. He tries to outmaneuver it, veering slightly left, then right, hoping the other driver will take the hint and pass. But the car mirrors his every move, swaying with a deadly precision that makes his chest tighten. It's not just following him, it's toying with him, a predator stalking its prey. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the cool night air. He swerves again, more sharply this time, trying to throw the car off. The truck groans under the sudden shift, but the phantom vehicle stays with him, moving as if it's reading his every thought, anticipating his every turn. It inches closer, the space between them narrowing, suffocating. A tremor of fear snakes through him. This isn't a case of road rage. This thing, whatever it is, isn't just another driver. No horn blares, no angry flashes of high beams. It's silent, eerily so, like a ghost chasing him through the night. He can feel it now, deep in his bones. This car doesn't belong here on this road. It doesn't belong in the world of the living. His mind races, searching for answers. What is it? Why is it following him? As the headlights flicker slightly, casting strange shadows on the road ahead, he remembers the rumors. The stories other truckers had whispered over late-night coffee, about the road, about the disappearances. Men who vanished without a trace. Rig after rig found abandoned, the drivers gone, as if they were swallowed by the night itself. His heart pounds harder. Could this be what they meant? Could this be the thing they spoke of in hushed voices, warning newcomers to avoid the highway after dark? The trucker's thoughts spiral as the ghostly car looms behind him, a relentless predator in the rearview mirror. His mind floods with fragments of those warnings, stories that once seemed like superstitions told by weary drivers to pass the time. But now, with that cursed car bearing down on him, they feel all too real. He presses harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck to its limit. The engine growls, protesting the strain, but the mysterious vehicle never wavers. It doesn't seem to follow the same rules of physics. Every turn, every swerve he makes, the car mimics, almost gliding along the cracked asphalt without effort. There's no sound from its engine, no screech of tires, only the heavy, oppressive silence that wraps around him like a noose. The radio crackles with static again, the same eerie sound that greeted him earlier, only now it's louder, more insistent. Fragments of voices slip through the interference, garbled and distant. They sound like whispers, as though someone or something is trying to reach him from the other side. A cold shiver runs down his spine as he realizes the whispers aren't coming from his radio, but from somewhere deep within the night. He has to get away. Frantically, he scans the road ahead. He knows this highway well, knows the gas stations and rest stops are few and far between, but none of that matters now. Escape is all that's on his mind. Up ahead, there's an exit, an old unmarked road he's never taken before, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. Without thinking, he jerks the wheel to the right, sending the truck careening toward the narrow path. The truck lurches violently as it hits the rough terrain, the wheels struggling for traction on the dirt and gravel. The headlights behind him waver for the first time, flickering as the car struggles to follow. For a brief moment, hope flares in his chest. Maybe this is his chance. But just as quickly as the headlights dimmed, they surge back to life, brighter and more aggressive than ever. The car follows him onto the dirt road, moving with a terrifying smoothness, as if the rough ground doesn't affect it at all. It's closer now, close enough that he can see the outline of the vehicle in his side mirror, a rusted, decrepit thing, barely holding together. But there's no driver, the seat is empty, his blood runs cold. He realizes now, this isn't just a haunted road, this is something far worse. The trucker's breath catches in his throat as he stares at the empty seat in the rearview mirror. No driver, no life, just a rusted, decaying shell of a vehicle, impossibly keeping pace with his rig on the rough dirt road. Panic grips him tighter than ever, his heart hammering against his chest. This isn't a game of cat and mouse anymore. This is a chase with something not of this world. The terrain grows rougher, the road narrowing into a barely visible trail through the desert. The truck bounces violently over the uneven ground, the steering wheel vibrating in his hands. He's losing control, both of the vehicle and of his nerves. But stopping isn't an option. He knows that much. Stopping would mean facing whatever that thing is, and deep down, he knows there's no surviving that encounter. The headlights behind him flicker again, but this time, they dim just enough for him to catch a glimpse of something more in the rearview mirror. The shadows inside the rusted car shift and twist, almost as if something is moving in the back seat. His pulse spikes. He forces himself to look again, despite the dread curling in his gut. And there they are, faces. Faint, ghostly faces pressed against the cracked, fogged windows. Their expressions frozen in horror, eyes wide and mouths agape in silent screams. They look like they're trapped, begging for release, their features distorted by the grime and dust that coat the car's glass. The trucker's stomach churns with the sickening realization. These are the lost souls, the ones who disappeared from this cursed road. The whispers return, louder now, more distinct. He can almost make out their words, but they're fractured, like voices carried on the wind. They plead, they warn, but their message is unclear, lost in the chaos of static and the roar of his engine. All he knows is that the car behind him is more than just a haunted relic. It's a prison for those it claims, and now it's after him. With a surge of desperation, he floors the gas, the truck lurching forward with all the power it can muster. The rig groans in protest, but he doesn't care. He has to outrun this thing, has to break free from the nightmare that's chasing him. The dirt road snakes through the desert, winding into unfamiliar territory, but there's no time to think, no time to plan. His only goal is to get as far away from the ghostly car as possible, but the rusted vehicle won't let him go. It stays on his tail, relentless, its headlights flickering like dying embers in the rear view. The faces of the lost souls press closer against the windows, their terror palpable, their silent screams growing more frantic with every passing second. It's as if they know the end is near, for both them and him. The trucker's mind races, searching for a way out, some last-ditch effort to survive. He knows the road is running out, that soon he'll have no choice but to face whatever fate awaits him. The trucker's heart pounds as the road ahead twists and narrows, leading him deeper into the desert's darkness. Every instinct tells him there's no escape, but he refuses to accept it. The faces in the cursed car grow more desperate, their eyes hollow and haunting, as if they know he's close to joining them. The whispers around him grow louder, echoing in the cab of his truck like the cries of the damned. He's running out of time. The exit ahead is barely visible, a sharp turn leading toward a cliff that drops into the abyss of the desert. He hesitates for a split second. There's no way out. The road ends here, but the thought of stopping, of letting that ghostly vehicle catch him, is worse than death itself. He makes his decision. With a sudden, reckless twist of the wheel, the truck veers off the dirt road and toward the cliff. The rig skids violently, the back end fishtailing as dust and gravel kick up around him. The ghostly car follows, its headlights burning brighter, like the eyes of a predator sensing its prey's desperation. It's close now, so close he can feel the chill of its unnatural presence seeping through the cab. The cliff's edge rushes toward him, and for a moment, the trucker's mind goes blank. The rig teeters on the brink, wheels spinning as the earth crumbles beneath him. The ghost car is right there, a twisted shadow, its headlights bearing down on him with impossible intensity. But then, with a desperate surge of adrenaline, the trucker slams the gear shift into reverse. The rig lurches backward, tires screeching, just as the ghostly vehicle surges forward to finish the chase. For a breathless second, the two vehicles are locked in a deadly dance, one fighting to survive, the other to claim another victim. Then, with a sickening screech of metal, the ghost car's momentum carries it over the edge. The headlights flicker wildly, the twisted shadows of the lost souls vanishing in a haze of dust as the vehicle plummets into the void. For a moment, there's silence, a chilling stillness, as the trucker's rig comes to a shuddering halt, inches from the cliff's edge. The roar of the ghost car fades into the darkness below, swallowed by the endless desert. The trucker sits frozen, hands trembling on the wheel, his heart racing in his chest. He stares into the abyss where the car disappeared, disbelief washing over him. Did he actually survive? Did he escape whatever curse haunted that road? But as the dust settles, a creeping realization slithers into his mind. The road doesn't let anyone go that easily. He may have won the battle, but the night still feels alive around him. The trucker sits in the cab, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel, his breath ragged. The silence after the chaos is deafening. The ghostly car is gone, plunged into the abyss, but the air still feels heavy, like the desert itself is holding its breath. He dares to believe it's over, that he's escaped the nightmare, but deep down, the dread lingers. With trembling hands, he shifts the truck into drive and slowly pulls away from the cliff's edge, his heart still pounding in his chest. The road ahead stretches out into the darkness, endless and unforgiving. The trucker's eyes flick nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights flicker back to life, but there's only darkness behind him. Yet something about that darkness feels wrong, too quiet, too still. He drives on, the rig rumbling along the rough terrain as he tries to calm his racing thoughts. The faces he saw in the ghost car still haunt him, their desperate expressions burned into his mind. They were more than just echoes of the past. They were warnings, trapped souls that had been claimed by this cursed road. And for a moment, he wonders if he's really escaped, or if the road is simply waiting, biding its time before it comes for him again. The trucker wipes a hand across his brow, trying to shake off the paranoia creeping over him. He tells himself it's over, that whatever haunted this stretch of highway is gone. But as the miles tick by, the oppressive silence grows heavier. The desert stretches on endlessly, and no matter how far he drives, the feeling of being watched clings to him like a second skin. Then, just as he starts to relax, something catches his eye. In the rearview mirror, faint at first, but unmistakable, headlights. His blood runs cold. The lights are distant, barely a flicker on the horizon, but they're there, creeping closer with every second. His hands tighten on the wheel, a sickening realization washing over him. The car didn't fall. It didn't disappear into the abyss. It's still out there, hunting him. The trucker's pulse quickens again as he watches the lights grow brighter, closer. His heart pounds in his chest, the terror returning in full force. He presses down on the gas, the truck groaning as it picks up speed. But it doesn't matter. The headlights stay in his mirror, relentless, unyielding. He knows now, there's no escape. This road, this cursed stretch of desert, doesn't let anyone go. It claimed those before him, and now it's coming for him. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the roar of his engine and the howl of the wind, the whispers begin again. The trucker's heart races, panic swelling in his chest as the headlights creep closer, cutting through the darkness like silent predators. He's driving as fast as the truck can handle, the engine straining under the pressure, but the lights remain, haunting him from the rearview mirror. He feels trapped, caught in a nightmare where no matter how far or fast he goes, the road will always lead him back to this moment. The truck rattles over the uneven terrain, but the phantom car's movements remain smooth, unnatural. It's like it's gliding, unhindered by the laws of the physical world. He keeps his eyes on the road ahead, hands trembling on the wheel, but his mind is spiraling into fear. He knows now that the highway isn't just cursed, it's a hunter, and he's the prey. The whispers grow louder, the static on the radio crackling to life again. Only this time it feels like they're coming from the very air around him, filling the cab of his truck. It's the voices of the lost, the souls trapped on this forsaken road. They call out to him, pleading, warning, their messages fractured and desperate. Turn back. Never leave. You belong. He grips the steering wheel tighter, refusing to listen, refusing to accept that his fate is sealed. But deep down, he knows. This road has claimed him, just like it claimed the others. The lights behind him glow brighter, now just feet away from his truck's rear bumper. They're closing in. A wave of dread crashes over him as a thought pierces his mind. The road will never let him leave. No matter how fast or far he drives, it will keep him trapped here, endlessly circling back to that cursed vehicle. His only choices are to surrender or to fight a battle he cannot win. In a final act of defiance, he veers hard to the right, skidding off the dirt path and plunging the truck into the wilderness. The rig barrels through the desert, bouncing over rocks and scrub, the wheels struggling for traction. He hopes, prays that by leaving the road he can escape the curse. But the lights follow, steady and unshaken by the rough terrain. They are relentless. The trucker's breath comes in ragged gasps as the desert stretches out before him, endless and barren. He can see nothing but darkness and hear nothing but the whispers and the rumble of his truck. The ghost car's lights are blinding now, almost on top of him, their brightness filling the cab with an unearthly glow. And then, without warning, the truck jolts violently, the wheels catching on something unseen. The steering wheel is ripped from his hands as the truck swerves uncontrollably. He fights to regain control, but it's too late. The rig tips, metal groaning and screeching as the world turns upside down. The truck flips, once, twice. Time slows as he's thrown against the seat, the sound of crashing metal and shattering glass ringing in his ears. Dust fills the air as the cab comes to a grinding halt, resting on its side. The world spins around him, and for a moment, all is silent. He lies there, disoriented, his body aching from the crash. The desert stretches out around him, quiet and still. He forces himself to breathe, to move, to escape the wreckage. But as he fumbles with the seatbelt, trying to free himself, something flickers in the corner of his eye. Headlights. The ghostly vehicle looms just outside the truck, its lights shining directly into the wreckage, as if watching him. Waiting, the trucker freezes. He knows now, with bone-deep certainty, that it's over. This thing, this entity, has won. He's no longer just another driver on the road. He's the next in line. The whispers return, louder than ever, filling his mind with the screams of the souls already claimed. The voices are no longer pleading, they're welcoming. As the headlights grow brighter, the trucker's vision blurs, darkness creeping in from the edges of his consciousness. He tries to move, to escape, but his body feels heavy, too heavy to lift. His heart pounds one last time as the shadows close in, and he finally understands what happened to the others who disappeared on this highway. In the end, the road always claims its victims. The trucker is gone. The desert is silent once more. And the road, as always, waits for the next soul foolish enough to cross it.